Support for I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere comes from MX Publishing, with the largest catalog of new Sherlock Holmes books in the world. New novels, biographies, graphic novels, and short story collections about Sherlock Holmes. Find them at mxpublishing.com.
And listeners like you who support us on Patreon or Substack, sign up for exclusive benefits at patreon.com/ihearofsherlock or ihearofsherlock.substack.com.
Episode 298, Monsters and Ghosts.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became astronomer.
In a world where it's always 1895, it's I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we interview authors, editors, creators, and other prominent Sherlockians on various aspects of the great detective in popular culture.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Bert Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
I'm Bill Curtis. This is I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Now, here are your hosts, Scott Monty and Bert Wolder.
Well, hello and welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, are you more of a monster or a ghost?
Yes, that's exactly right. Well, the way I walk is stormy through no fault of my own. But what's the rest of that? The way you walk is stormy through no fault of your own.
I don't know.
It's Maria Ouspenskaya's speech from The Wolfman, where she says, still become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the moon is full and bright. I think that's it. Yeah.
Oh, that sounds almost poetic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, we have a fine guest with us today. You'll be hearing more about him in just a moment. And so we don't spare you the suspense, he is Ed Pettit. He's been with us before on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, and he's back to talk about something thematic with regards to Halloween. 'Tis the season, after all, and we thought we would pull out references to monsters and ghosts, talk about some parallels here with Conan Doyle, Bram Stoker, and more. So it is a delightful conversation, and there are some gems for you in terms of links ahead. So make sure you check your show notes for the links related to today's discussion. Of course, in those show notes, you can also find links to help us out on Patreon or Substack. You can support the show with a means that works for you at whatever level makes sense. We are at patreon.com/ihearofsherlock and ihearofsherlock.substack.com. Our supporters get the benefit of ad-free episodes, and you also get bonus content from time to time, whether it's outtakes or additional conversations or what have you. And on Patreon, at a certain level, we also thank you with some thank you gifts. So figure out what works for you and support us on whatever means are necessary. And also, don't forget to rate and review the show, or rate or review the show, if you'd prefer, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever platform you happen to be listening to us on. We've been rising in the ranks on Good Pods lately. It's a podcast recommendation and community site. You can check us out there. We've got links to wherever you want to listen to us on in the show notes. So thank you in advance. Okay, that means it's time for everyone's second favorite part of the show. That's right, the Sherlockian news. All the news that fits, we put in this segment. Bert, where do we send people for their Sherlockian news this time? What do we have for them?
Well, there are a variety of things. One place we could start is with the CBS series called Watson, which is starring the actor Morris Chestnut. There's been a lot of talk about that. And one of the things that Morris Chestnut said in an upcoming, in an interview that he did, was that Moriarty is in the story. And this was a reported comment that he made in the course of an interview, I think, around which the episode or the details around Watson were revealed. And basically what happens is that the first episode, at least, is dealing with Watson's grieving cycle, because it's set 6 months after Sherlock Holmes' death, which is after the crime that Moriarty has committed. So we see Watson still dealing with that. So we know Moriarty's involved. Not that it probably took a tremendous amount of surprise away from anybody, but the good news, Moriarty will be involved in Watson.
Well, that is good news. I mean, Moriarty is, kind of the undershadow, the undercurrent of pretty much every Sherlock Holmes production. So to be able to get that out of the way and address it head on, that's, I guess that's encouraging. We'll see how they do with it, though. That'll be the ultimate question. Well, I'm not sure if we mentioned this the last time around. There wouldn't seem to be too much of a direct connection, but listen up, because you may follow along with us here. Dame Maggie Smith passed away on September 27th. I think she was 90 years old, or nearly 90. She first appeared in film in the 1920s, made her stage debut in London in her 20s in 1956, made her stage debut in London in 1957. And of course, she became a star on the stage and on screens large and small. She was Dora Charleston, which was the fake version of Nora from Nick and Nora, Thin Man fame, in Murder by Death in 1976. But for Sherlockians among us, and by the way, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson did make an appearance in Murder by Death in an outtake scene. Originally, they were supposed to show up at the very last minute, solve it, and upstage all of the other detectives. But I think the actors who played those detectives objected to that theme, so never made it past the cutting room floor. But she did appear as Lady Blueberry in Sherlock Gnomes in 2018. And she was previously married to, do you know who?
Oh, yeah, Robert Stevens.
Robert Stevens, who played Sherlock Holmes in The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. So,
no, not her happiest time, as I understand it.
No.
And in the world of books, one of the greatest publications that we have had in a good while was the amazing catalog for Sherlock Holmes in 221 objects. Because a very lavish book. Not only is it a great collection, and it was a great exhibition at a great organization, the Grolier Club in New York, but the catalog itself, the book, is a real tribute to the book arts. The production, the quality of the photographs, the binding, the imprints. It's just a lovely book. The size of it, oversized, to add to your collection. But it was pretty pricey. Aha! But don't worry about that, because between now and December 1st, you, sitting right there, you can get a copy of this book, Kathy and Glenn Maranker's Spectacular Sherlock Holmes in 221 Objects catalog. Discounted half price, only $40 American. Just use the club Grolier sale when you go to Grolier Club, Grolier Club.com. And of course, we'll have the link for that in the show notes. The book was produced by the University of Chicago Press and led by Kathy and Glenn Maranker, with Kathy, as Glenn likes to say, doing most of the work.
Well, and she did a fine job, too. So check that out. We'll have the link in the show notes, as Bert said. And finally, is Sherlock perhaps on its way back to the BBC? Well, according to Sue Vertu, the brand has a future after Mark Gatiss has raised some hopes for more episodes. She said it's likely to return. We love that the show is there, and there's a future for it one day, maybe, if everyone wants to do it.
That's a big if.
Yeah. Well, okay. So if all the planets align and everyone agrees and, hops on one foot and rubs their tummy and pats their head, then we'll do it. We'll see. Gatiss said we'd like to make a film, but trying to get everyone together is very difficult. Well, that's always been the problem, hasn't it?
Yeah.
So we'll see whether everyone's stars align at some point in the future, but hope springs eternal for fans of BBC Sherlock.
Yes, yeah. Sue Vertu apparently made these comments at an Amazon event, the Amazon Prime Video Trailblazers event in London, where she also said, I've still got the set in storage somewhere, which is probably rotten, to be honest with you. So we have that to look forward to, too.
And she also said, bartender, I'll take that fifth martini now. No, she didn't say that.
No.
Well, like we said, there's always a chance. Who knows what it may look like many years from now, but we'll see. And that'll do it for things from the Sherlockian news desk here at IHOSE Media. Just in time for the holiday season, our friends at MX Publishing have Mr. Holmes's Advent Calendar, a 4-book series. Even in the Advent season, Mr. Holmes can't take a break. Murderers, blackmailers, and all kinds of odd incidents keep him on the go. And Watson isn't much of a help, as he's busying himself with baking all those Christmas cookies for his dog. Mr. Holmes's criminal fiction Advent Calendar has 24 short detective stories that challenge your puzzle-solving skills, one for each day of Advent. Follow in the famous master detective's footsteps and use the evidence available to deduce what might have happened, find vital clues, decipher codes, check alibis, and solve the crime case until the next morning when you turn the page and find Mr. Holmes's solution and another exciting case waiting for you. It's great fun for all fans of Sherlock Holmes and criminal fiction. Solve the mystery and be faster than the famous detective. Check out all 4 volumes of Mr. Holmes's Advent Calendar by MX Publishing today. Edward G. Pettit is the Sunstein Senior Manager of Public Programs at the Rosenbach and has been presenter for the weekly Biblioventures series, which includes Sundays with Dracula, Sundays with Frankenstein, Sundays with Jane Eyre, Austen Mondays, Pride and Prejudice, and also Pickwick Monthly. And now you're hearing him as one of the co-hosts of Sherlock Mondays. Pettit has taught many reading courses at the Rosenbach on many authors and books, including Sherlock Holmes stories, Dracula, Frankenstein, and the novels of Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, Edgar Allan Poe, and Philadelphia Gothic. He's a member of the Philadelphia Baker Street Irregular Science Society, the Sons of the Copper Beeches, serving as the recorder of pedigrees, and has probably never read a Sherlock Holmes story without smoking a pipe while reading. Ed Pettit, welcome back to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Thank you so much for having me back during my favorite time of the year, the Halloween season.
Well, this is going to be fun. We did want to ask you here because of the holiday implications, but just as a reminder for our listeners, Ed appeared with us last season on episode 277 to talk about the Sherlock Mondays biblioventures. There's a new show in town. There's a lot of new shows in town, but Ed, why don't we start out by you telling us about the Sherlock Monthly program you've got going on?
Thank you. Well, Sherlock Mondays was such a success, and after I wound up doing 40 episodes of it.
Wow.
30 on Sherlock Holmes stories, 2 on some other detectives, and I did 8 subscription-only Hound of the Baskervilles. And it's not enough. I need to do Sherlock all the time. And I figured out a way to do it. Once a month, we'll cover a story. We'll continue the order they were chronologically published. We're up to the Norwood Builder, so that'll be the first one. It'll air it'll stream live on November 16th, 2024, and then thereafter it'll be every month. I'll have different co-hosts every month. The Norwood Builder is going to have Ross Davies, who edited the Norwood Builder manuscript book, whose name the name of that book escapes me, and Paul Chapman from Doings of Doyle, or not Paul Chapman, Mark Jones. I'm sorry, Mark Jones and Ross Davies will co-host the Norwood Builder episode with me. Paul Chapman has been on my other show.
Jeez, it's hard to keep them all straight.
For the Rosenbach, yeah.
Wow.
So,
that book, is that, no, that's not Clutches of a Fiend. That's The Illustrious Client. My goodness. It's from, Norwood Builder.
I forget what the title is.
This is terrible that we're blanking on it like this, but I have to go to my resource here and figure it out. Manuscript series. Oh, Masterpiece of Villainy.
Masterpiece of Villainy, thank you.
Good job. Well, that sounds like a lot of fun. So, folks can sign up for that at the link in our show notes. We'll have links to all of the things we're talking about today, so you don't need to fret and run out later. We'll have it all in the show notes. So wherever you're listening to us, just check the notes there, and you can find it. Or, of course, you can go to ihearofsherlock.com and find it there as well. Well, Ed, we talked with you about the biblioventures series a little more widely the last time, but we really focused on Sherlock Holmes. But there are monster-related, macabre-related, spooky elements here. There seems to be a theme running through this, and we wanted to touch on some of those since it is the Halloween season. But why don't you take us back to the beginning of the creation of this program and tell us a little bit about how it got started?
Thanks. Biblioventures began as a result of the pandemic, and we were all sent home, and so nice, the Rosenbach Museum and Library said, we're going to continue paying you, Ed, but you have to come out with new programs without them being in person. So I came up with a series called Sundays with Dracula, in which we would work our way through Dracula in weekly episodes. And that's a connection for the Rosenbach because we have Bram Stoker's notes for Dracula, the research notes. It's about 100 pages or so, early plot ideas, his research notes that he compiled over the 7 years that he researched and wrote Dracula. That and it all fit perfectly because Dracula is 27 chapters, and I said we'll do a chapter a week. We wound up doing 28 weeks. We did an extra special show at 1 chapter a week. And the novel itself, because it's letters, journal entries, it's all dated, and it began on May 3rd. That's when the novel begins. And I thought, I could, start this on May 3rd. This was in April, I was thinking this, which was crazy. I'll start a show, and I had less than a month to put it together. I got co-hosts to come on with me, a rotating set of co-hosts. And the novel itself is also 27 weeks, 27 chapters in 27 weeks. It ends on, actually, Dracula is killed on November 6th. So we got to do that. We had special guests come in. Kim Newman came on for an episode, Dacre Stoker, David Scahl. I got Sir Christopher Frayling to come on for the final episode. Mark Gatiss came on and did an interview episode, because this was shortly after he had done his Dracula series for the BBC. And so the whole thing worked so well, we have to keep this going. And then we did Sundays with Frankenstein. And then we were out of monster books at the Rosenbach. So I was like, what am I going to do? I know, we'll keep it gothic. And we did Jane Eyre, and we did Sundays with Jane Eyre. And then we were really out of kind of those similarly themed things at the time. But I wanted to keep going, and I wanted to do books that I loved and were still part of our collections. So we did Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. But I had also realized I've just given up every Sunday of my life, and I need to change that. So we moved it to Mondays, and then it became Austen Mondays, and then we did Sherlock Mondays. We have quite a Doyle collection at the Rosenbach, and this current season is called Biblioventures Monsters and Ghosts, because we now do have another monster book in our collection. We acquired a first edition, a true first edition, because it's the first American edition of Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which was actually published in America a few days before it was published in England. And so we just finished a series on Jekyll and Hyde, a 6-episode series with Olivia Ritigliano and Paul Chapman as co-hosts, and Les Klinger. Les Klinger did the final episode with me because he has an annotated Jekyll and Hyde. Les has been on every show that he has an annotated edition for. He's been on Dracula, he's been on Frankenstein, and now he's been on the Jekyll and Hyde. And then I will spin this off into do a 6 episodes on A Christmas Carol. That's the ghosts part of the Monsters and Ghosts. A story I love that's not... It's not just a Christmas story. As a matter of fact, it's more of a ghost story, I think, than it is a Christmas story. And that'll be a lot of fun to do. And that starts very soon, this month on November 11th.
November 11th, wow. It's just fabulous, what you've done there. I imagine you've seen the impact on the gate. Has membership and participation and visitors at the museum picked up because of this?
It's worked very well, and we also run courses, reading courses, and many of them are online. And what's happened now since doing these shows and other things online, our membership and viewership is all over the world right now. Somebody watching the Jekyll and Hyde show from New Zealand last night. That's something that was not around before we began these digital ventures. So it's helped considerably to expand our audience and to let people know about this extraordinary collection we have at the Rosenbach. So that's really great.
Well, it's interesting because it really works in two ways. On the one hand, you raise the profile of the Rosenbach and you attract these non-traditional or non-past traditional audiences around the world. But also, it's engagement. You're reaching communities of people that would not otherwise know about the Rosenbach and deepen their engagement with the holdings as well as the literature. It's interesting. And
people love it's the community aspect that's really key to this. And obviously during the pandemic, when people stuck in their houses, they were really searching for and needing to connect with people. But this has been true, since the lockdowns ended. And it's very true with books and with books that people love. You want to find other people. We know this in the Sherlockian community, obviously. You want to find other people who love it as well and connect with them. And even when it's just, say, in a chat while I'm doing a live show, people really bond to those and form these little communities around these books that when shows end, people are sometimes a little upset.
Yeah, well, like they're upset when they get to the end of the Sherlock Holmes stories. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about was the connections between Dracula and Sherlock Holmes and between Bram Stoker and Arthur Conan Doyle. One of the things I noticed on the Arthur Conan Doyle Encyclopedia a while ago, and you mentioned this maybe tangentially earlier, you just said that it took Stoker 7 years to write Dracula and that you've got his notes. And I know that they were both Irish writers, Arthur Conan Doyle and Bram Stoker. Stoker, I think, was something like 10 years older than Conan Doyle. But one of the things I noticed in the Arthur Conan Doyle Encyclopedia was that Stoker, A, was a Sherlock Holmes fan, and B, in his first version of Dracula, he thought that maybe the Holmes stories could be a model. He had the idea of a psychic researcher, a policeman, a Watson-like history teacher. Is all of that true?
There's an original list of a cast of characters, historiae personae, Stoker calls it, as he's listing them all out. And he lists them out as, there's a left column that is the type of person that they are, or their title, and there's doctor of a madhouse, girl engaged to him, mad patient, lawyer, his clerk, and on down a whole list. And then to the right, he has names that were probably written in sometimes then, sometimes a little later. And this is his original conception of these are the characters I'm going to work with. And this is also very theatrical too, right? That he's setting up a cast that'll come out on the stage. Stoker works for Henry Irving, the Lyceum Theater. So and all of Dracula is very theatrical in its construction. The names that he puts down, first of all, the Count. He's the Count. He's not Dracula. He's the Count, and his name is actually Count Vampire. His name is Count Vampire. That was originally what he thought, and that's all through the notes. And then he comes across the name Dracula, and he crosses it out, and then he's Dracula. But there's a list of characters that he doesn't include, and it is a detective, a psychical research agent, a German professor, a painter. Oh, and then a Texan. He does include the Texan. That becomes Quincy. But the detective, he even named him. He was going to call him Cotford, Cotford. The psychical research agent was Alfred Singleton, and the German professor was Max Windschafel. I think, and if you know Dracula at all, and you know the character of Van Helsing, he seems to have combined those characters, the detective, the research agent, the professor. They kind of become Van Helsing. He doesn't need to have them singly. But I really think that he's got a detective in the beginning, and you can see in some of the notes, some of the early outlines, that when Dracula comes to London, and mystery is a word that's several times used, and they're trying to solve and figure out things that are going on. And I think Doyle is very likely envisioning this as part of this is a kind of detective story that goes on where somebody has to figure out who's murdering or who's behind this. And then as the plot develops, I think he realizes that that's not actually the case. Although Van Helsing himself and that character is very influential in what becomes the subgenre of occult detectives, of people, and then this is, my favorite is Carnacki, of these detectives who investigate supernatural occurrences.
Yeah, you just mentioned Doyle, and I think you meant to mention Stoker as imagined.
The names blend in my head.
Yeah. Do you know that list of characters? When I first went to the Rosenbach some years ago, I remember there was all the Dracula material, or a good deal of it, on display, and I remember the joy of seeing those notes, that tiny little hand on that smallish piece of paper where he'd listed all those characters. It's really something.
And anyone can come, I should say this right now, anyone can come and see our notes. You do not have to have some kind of, they even let Burt Walter come and see them.
Yeah, I got in. I was surprised.
Our collection is open to the general public. You can go on the Rosenbach website and set a research appointment and say, I want to see the Dracula notes. And we'll put you in our reading room and bring the Dracula notes out and stick them right in front of you, and you can page through them yourself.
Yeah. Now you mentioned a minute ago the Lyceum Theater. I don't know if our listeners, all of our listeners, realize Stoker's role in the Lyceum Theater, and I know he produced one of Conan Doyle's plays that was reasonably successful, was sort of a one-man show for Henry Irving, which is based on one of Conan Doyle's short stories about an old soldier who was at Waterloo, and it's called The Story of Waterloo. But you want to talk for a minute or two about Stoker's non-authorial work, his professional work at the Lyceum Theater and so on?
Like almost all writers, and this doesn't become true for Doyle until a little later, but for Stoker it's true. Like most writers, he needs another job. Writing has traditionally never paid enough to support people. And Stoker's job, his day job, is managing the Lyceum Theater and also managing the affairs, the life, kind of as a secretary, Henry Irving, who becomes Sir Henry Irving, the first actor ever knighted. And he's responsible for all his travel arrangements and arranging everything in the theater and managing and making sure everything goes off right and managing these elaborate dinners that happen that Irving likes to have after shows where, other dignitaries come and famous artists. And so Stoker winds up being very connected in really all of society because Henry Irving is such a superstar that everybody wants to know him and meet him. And the way to get to Henry Irving is through Bram Stoker. And so that's the life that he leads. That's his 24/7 job. He's always has to be available for Henry Irving, and he does that for many years. He met him. Irving was touring a show in Ireland when Stoker was still in Ireland, and he meets him there, and then writes a great review of him, and then meets him. And Irving asks him to come and manage his theater and manage his life, which he does until Irving dies.
Now, this wasn't the first crossover between Conan Doyle and Bram Stoker. I'm not sure if our listeners are aware of this, but back in 1891-92. There was an experimental serial novel published called The Fate of Fenella. Mm-hmm. Do you know anything about that, Ed?
It was serialized in a weekly newspaper, 91 to 92, and it's maybe as many as 20 off. Everybody writes a chapter, and both Stoker and Doyle wrote chapters. I can't recall. One other chapter, Frances Marryat. I only know her name because she wrote a vampire novel called Blood of the Vampire. And other than that, the authors are virtually unknown to us now. But Stoker's name and Doyle's name are both in there. And and I wonder if that's their first point of contact, actually. It may be... Stoker, when Doyle then is starting to get known in these literary circles, it's around the same time, right? I mean, the Sign of Four is 90, so this is shortly after that, and then this is when Doyle I'm not going to be, I can make enough money writing, and his magazine fiction is selling well enough that he can just rely on that. So they meet. They're wind up. They're both in the Irish Literary Society, but I'm not sure that happens until maybe the turn of the century. I don't know how early that goes, but there's letters between them. I have read somewhere that Stoker even went to Doyle's wedding, his second wedding, but I can't confirm. Like, I'm not sure how that was confirmed. That he went to his wedding. But they were certainly close enough that they were writing letters to each other, warm letters to each other as well.
Yeah. Well, Stoker wrote an interview with Conan Doyle in September of 1907.
He did?
I'm sorry. The September 1907 was when Conan Doyle was married. But in 1907, Stoker wrote this interview with Conan Doyle where he talked about his work and America and his marriage and all this stuff.
He did, and it's one of those profile interviews that he does of Doyle, and Doyle even talks about his life and his father, and there's a little piece that ties in with his father and ties in with the kind of, this idea of these are two writers who are also interested in writing spooky stories. Doyle had the quote that Stoker uses from Doyle is, "My people on the father's side," said the creator of Sherlock Holmes. I love that they have to stick that in there. This is Sherlock Holmes' creator we're talking about. Where we were all artists of a peculiarly imaginative type. My father, Charles Doyle, was in truth a great unrecognized genius. His wild and strange fancies alarmed, I think, rather than pleased the stolid Scotchmen of the 50s and 60s. His mind ran on strange moonlight effects done with extraordinary skill in watercolors, dancing witches, drowning seamen, death coaches on lonely moors at night, and goblins chasing children across churchyards. So, Doyle's talking about the kind of things that he heard from the pictures that he saw his father painting and the stories he heard. He also talks in that about his mother scaring him with stories when he was a child. So that goes very well with the whole Doyle and Stoker both interested in writing stories that will do that.
Well, what do we know, Ed, about the later influence? We come to the Adventure of the Sussex Vampire, which was published in January of 1924. What do we know about Stoker's perhaps influence on Doyle? It would have been almost 30 years since the publication of Dracula at that point, but what do we know about that influence and Doyle's decision in 1924 to suddenly write a Sherlock Holmes story concerning vampires?
It's interesting because it's right around the time Dracula goes on stage, and I'm trying to remember if it's then or slightly after. I'm trying to remember when the Hamilton play. Yeah, it's 1924 as the Hamilton Dean play hits the stage, and that becomes really the point that vampires and Dracula especially enter pop culture. Dracula was a book that people read. It didn't go out of print, but it wasn't this monster bestseller that everybody knew what it was. It was just a book that, a bunch of people had read, and it's the stage vampire, it's the stage Dracula that then expands it into pop culture, and then clearly the play goes to Broadway, it goes to England, and then to Broadway, and then it becomes the movie in 1931 with Bela Lugosi. Before that Lugosi Dracula movie, most people knew vampires from the stage. The more people knew vampires from the stage than they did from reading about vampires. And that's true of Dracula in the 20th century. When this stage play happens in the 20s, and also before then in the 19th century, there are more stage vampires than there are vampires in fiction. So I wonder I don't know the exact time, like when he's working on the story and when Doyle was working on his Sussex Vampire story, and as if that didn't kind of revivify the idea for him to like, oh, Dracula, that's right, Bram had written that. And Stoker really liked Dracula, so he didn't need to discover it through this. It's just that it may have put it out in the air for him to think about again.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about. I mean, perhaps his literary agent or some other connection that he had could have shared with him the plans for this play.
Yeah.
Even though the play didn't appear until after the Sussex Vampire was published. You talk about the months leading up to it. Of course, there was some chatter. But it might be interesting to see if there is anything in Doyle's correspondence that reflects that. Of course, it wouldn't be with Stoker because he died in 1912.
Yeah, he's dead by then. So
unless Conan Doyle held a seance
and spoke with him, because Doyle's very. Go ahead.
I was going to say no ghosts need apply.
Yes, well, maybe the ghost did apply in this situation. And Stoker not only knows the novel Dracula very well, but as soon as it's published, he writes a letter to Stoker. My dear Bram Stoker, I am sure that you will not think it an impertinence if I write to tell you how very much I enjoyed reading Dracula. I think it is the very best story of diablerie. I love that, which I've read for many years. So, and he writes him a nice letter. So, and he ends it with all kindest remembrances to Mrs. Bram Stoker and yourself. Yours very truly, A. Conan Doyle. That's how you know they're friends, because you're. And say hello to your wife too, please. So he's read Dracula, he's enjoyed it, and of course he's enjoyed it. It is a great book.
Well, it's interesting, about the whole history of vampires in a couple of ways. I mean, one is my memory is that when you probably know about that. I hope you know about this because I'm probably completely wrong. But my vague memory is when Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. They were out in Switzerland, and this was the year when there was sort of a fog over the whole world because
the year without a summer.
The year without a summer, and Byron was there, and also a doctor. And my memory is that doctor Polidori wrote at some point, maybe then, when they were playing around with spooky stories, or at some other point, a vampire story.
Yes.
But even is that right? But even then, the vampire stuff is before that. There was a poem in the 18th century or something like that about vampires. You probably know more about this.
Polidori's The Vampire is the first vampire in English fiction. There are other vampires in poetry. There are some, in poetry from other European countries as well. There are folk tales about vampires that really seem to crop up in the late 17th, early 18th century. Before then, there are creatures like this in folk stories, but they're a little different, and they're hard to kind of differentiate between just any kind of reanimated ghoul, any reanimated person from the dead. But by the 18th century, they seem to become blood-drinking creatures from the dead who are cursed in some way. And Polidori doesn't write it that summer. But there's a story that Lord Byron writes, a fragment of a story that he abandons, that Polidori takes and then kind of refashions, completely rewrites and refashions into what becomes the first vampire story. And what's interesting about that is that Polidori's story is not only a vampire story, it's also a roman à clef. It's also a story about Byron, because the story is about this nobleman, Lord Riven, who goes around and preys upon others and sucks the life out of them and destroys their life and casts them aside, much like Byron was doing with many of the people in his life. And the name Lord Riven that Polidori gives him is a name that someone else had already given Byron in another roman à clef novel. One of Byron's old lovers, Lady Caroline Lamb, wrote a book in which the character Riven is based on Byron, and so everybody knew he was talking about Byron. So, but what this all means is Byron is the first vampire.
That's interesting. Do you know what? The interesting thing, too, about Dracula is how popular it became. And one of the reasons for that, I could be completely wrong, but one of the reasons I thought it became popular was because here's Stoker showing how this ancient Gothic evil could be on the streets of today's London. And there's a parallel there with mummies, too. We were talking earlier about mummies. And you want to talk a little bit about these other kinds of creatures who come lurching out of the past, but then seem disturbingly relevant as we dig up ancient Egypt's sarcophagi and so on.
Yeah, that what first with vampires and with Dracula, he is this creature from the past threatening the people in the present, and that's a Gothic story. A Gothic story is about a threat from the past that is coming now to haunt you, and it's harder for us to see Dracula that way because it's gaslit and they're riding coaches and it's clearly in the past for us when we read it. But when people were first reading Dracula, it would be like now reading a story set in the absolute present day that we are now with cell phones and technology and all this stuff, and there was a vampire preying upon people. That's the kind of story Stoker was writing, that people were thinking they're in this modern world free of superstition, forward-thinking, progressive, and suddenly it's a monster from the past. And Van Helsing, but luckily Van Helsing knows how to fight those things. And it does walk hand in hand with this kind of fascination with mummies. Mummies had become a very popular topic, and Egyptology had become very popular, especially in England, throughout the 19th century. People would literally have mummy unwrapping parties. Now, first of all, you have to have some means, probably, a little bit of money, but you would buy a mummy. The mummies were coming out. They were just these unscrupulous archaeologists were digging up mummies and selling them. And you would have a mummy party, and there's several instances of this where you'd invite all your friends over, and at the party, you would unwrap the mummy. Gruesome, yes. Fun, kind of. I don't know. I wish I had been to a mummy party. Now it's unethical, and I would never do it now. But but in the 19th century, when I had no ethics to think of that, maybe I would have been. But so macabre, and people were fascinated with this. And then mummy stories are coming about as well. And both Stoker and Doyle write on this. Stoker writes for me, really his second best work. And it's called Jewel of the Seven Stars. And it's a novel he publishes in 1903. And it is a mummy story. And this ancient mummy is coming back, and they have to fight the mummy or fight her. And she's powerful. And I think it's the best thing he did after Dracula. And Doyle, as some of you may know, wrote at least two great stories. I'm not sure if there's one he wrote. Lot 249, which I love, and which was recently made into Mark Gatiss did into a Christmas special for the BBC, a ghost story for Christmas. I'm so happy he did that, and also a story Doyle wrote called The Ring of Thoth, which is basically what the Universal ripped off to do their Mummy movie with Boris Karloff in 1932. The Ring of Thoth is like that whole story is kind of in the Mummy movie as well. And that's also my favorite Universal, believe it or not. The Mummy is my favorite Universal horror film. I'm one of the very few people that will choose that. I would choose to watch The Mummy over Frankenstein or Dracula.
That's fascinating. Well, we learned something about you today, Ed. Well,
now we know what to do for your next birthday party.
Hey, Ed, if you send your address our way, because Halloween is coming up, we will make you feel right at home, and we will toilet paper your house.
Well, there you go. That's happened before, though. You wouldn't be the first.
Well, I think, both in Lot 249 and The Ring of Thoth, well, and in the Universal film as well, that there's that foreboding sense of horror, that dread, that suspense, I think, that really brings us along. And, all of the writers from this period and those early films, they weren't necessarily gory which is, I think, how we think of a lot of these monsters today. They were subtle in nature, and it was more psychological in how they brought their readers and their viewers along.
People think that even, and that's true for a lot of 19th century writers and even, people who begin in the 19th and enter into the 20th. Even Poe. People think Poe's very gory. Well, if you read the story, it's actually not gory. He might describe it a couple, very quick lines, like a dismemberment or something. But they're actually not gory stories. And it's that psychological horror. It's that suspenseful threat that's slowly creeping towards you that is suddenly there, and you have to deal with it. And it's also that threat, as Bert was saying earlier, that kind of not just the threat from the past. This is true in mummy stories and many vampire stories. It's also a foreign threat, and this late 19th, early 20th century fear, anxiety over immigration and people invading us from other countries and threatening our way of life. Has this gone away? No, it is certainly not. And it is not surprising that these creatures, vampires and mummies, both come from they're both immigrant monsters who are seeking asylum, or they're perhaps illegal aliens invading to destroy us, to take our women too. It is a true anxiety that is in the air then, and it's not that Doyle and Stoker are saying, yeah, that's awful, we want to stop that kind of thing. It's just they can't help it because they're authors, because their antennae are up, and they pull this in from the air. They don't artists don't create in a vacuum. They bring in the especially when you're writing horror, you bring in the anxieties of your culture.
That's right, yeah. So tell me, Count Dracula, what are you going to be doing tomorrow? Well, luckily, the polling places are open at dusk, so I'm going to vote, of course.
Well, I, for one, vote that everybody get over to rosenbach.org and check out the programs and courses that are available there. Of course, that's where you will find, under programs and events, the next wave of Monsters and Ghosts featuring A Christmas Carol. And you can go back and take a look at the previous courses as well. Sundays with Dracula, Sundays with Frankenstein, of course, all the Austen things. And we would be remiss if we didn't mention Mondays with Sherlock. So go take it all in. If you are so inclined, become a member of the Rosenbach. Ed would love you for that, and so would we. And if you're in Philadelphia, go and visit and check this stuff out in person. Ed, any final words of caution as we head into Halloween?
Beware, there are such things, as Van Helsing says. So it's what a wonderful time of the year to have fun scaring ourselves. I really love it.
The Rosenbach is a treasure, and Ed is a treasure. It's you talk to Ed and you hear about his literary knowledge and his enthusiasm and his creativity, and he's a great Sherlockian. And he also answers the question. The whole conversation sort of answers the question, hey, why should we read today? And, it's just fun. It's just fun. And I really love talking to him.
Isn't it sad that we have to ask ourselves, why do we have to read today?
Yeah.
But Ed gives us more reasons every time we sit down with him. And, it's these nuggets that we dig upon. That letter that Ed referenced that Conan Doyle wrote to Bram Stoker after Dracula was published, simply calling out the word diablerie in it. I love that. And I want to figure out a way to put diablerie into some of my regular correspondence going forward.
I had a friend of mine who used to work at the Wall Street Journal, and he delighted, particularly when he got an A-head column on the front page, of using an unusual word. So if he could put Armageddon or schizophrenical or something like that. Get it past the editor and get that in there. It made his whole week. And diablerie is one of those words. That's great.
Yeah. Now, if I can only find a patisserie that would focus on diablerie, be a double hit.
Yeah.
It's A Chance of Listening with your correspondent, Madeline Quinones.
Hello, everyone. I'm Madeline Quinones, and today I'm here to talk about the start of a subgenre of Sherlockian podcasts, the Story Discussion Podcast. These shows take the canon on story by story, usually discussing them one at a time, with a blend of personal impressions, literary analysis, and historical research. The first of these podcasts was iHearofsherlock, run by Mike Ranieri and Jordy Telfer of the Bootmakers of Toronto. The hosts discussed each story in the canon one at a time, but also diverted down other related paths, and they had multiple guests on. Unfortunately, iHearofsherlock is no longer online, and I didn't know it existed until it was gone, so you can imagine my disappointment. The next podcast to do something similar is Lighting the Pipes, hosted by Scott Powell and Josh Taylor. To get through the canon in 2 years, they recorded episodes that would regularly pass the 2-hour and sometimes the 3-hour mark, fitting multiple short stories in a single long episode. They even had an acronym for their story analysis, straight from the show's name, PIPES, which stands for Principles, Investigation, Perpetrator, Environs, and Supporting Players. Once they finished up with the canon, they moved on to other mysteries and thrillers and the occasional Sherlockian adaptation. But from time to time, they release smaller episodes labeled LTP Selects to play their previous discussions of a single Sherlock Holmes story at a time. The Selects episodes, by the way, are the ones that I would recommend for checking out the show. I would in no way recommend starting with a 2 or 3+ hour episode. At least not without show notes that include timestamps, which this show does not do. And having started early in 2017, they're still going. I have heard that most podcasts don't make it to 5 years, which makes a lot of sense to me. Keeping a podcast going over a long period of time isn't easy. And to make it to 7 years, going on 8, as Lighting the Pipes has done, is pretty impressive. And that's it for today.
You know, it's interesting that stat about podcasts in 5 years. I've actually heard that most podcasts, the majority of podcasts, don't make it past 10 episodes, believe it or not.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. I should mention while we're talking about this,
yes,
that I've been at a number of Scion events since the middle of October, and there are people have come up to me. In addition, we generally talk about one of the three things: where you are, how come you're not there, how you are, and
what's that on your shirt?
What's that? Yeah, typically. My God, is that a stain or a design? If it's a design, it's very creative. Or do you need medical care? Is that leaking?
Are you all right, Walter?
Is that leaking out of you?
Yes.
Or how much they enjoy Madeline Quinones and this podcast segment, because they all say the same thing. I had no idea. And wow, I had no idea these podcasts were out there, and it's such a nice little segment. And thank you for doing that.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. You know, when you and Madeline both presented in Dayton earlier this year, and I saw that timeline that she put together, which, as we look at it now, was hilariously incomplete. I thought, wow, I didn't know about most of these. I'll bet other people would like to learn about them too. And here, Madeline, in her research, has pulled out even more. So I'm so glad to hear that it's resonating.
Yeah.
Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, you know what that means. Yes, it's time for Canonical Couplet, the Sherlockian quiz show where we give you 2 lines of poetry and ask you to try your hand at identifying which Sherlock Holmes story it is that we're talking about. If you were around here in the last episode, you may recall that we gave you this clue. Expensive ladies strain the longest purse, and silent watchdogs make things rather worse. Oh, okay, Bert. I'm going to turn it over to you despite my best judgment.
Oh, it's a wonderful case. It's another stolen gem case. What happens here is that Count Negretto Silvius has a stolen gem that he has hidden in an almond pastry. It's the case Watson called the marzipan scone.
No, but I'm glad you have some lovely pastry with you to kind of soothe the wound there. No,
that's not a pastry. That's my complexion.
It's very Cornish. Oh, no, that's pasty.
Pasty.
Oh, no, that is your complexion. All right, got it. So Eric Decker's to the rescue again. He says, I believe I have the answer. It's the story where Holmes and Watson helped the town of Rockridge, England, defend itself from a ruthless horse racing tycoon who wants to get rid of the townspeople to open a racetrack. It's the story Watson called Silver Blazing Saddles. Except I may be mistaking this for another story entirely, so it's more likely to be Silver Blaze. Well, that is correct, Eric. That is the answer we were looking for. So let's pull out the old prize wheel and give it a spin. There it is. Going around. And it lands on number 3. Number 3. And that looks like it is John Bergquist. Hey, John. John writes in, and he did answer correctly. He said, great interview with my friend Larry Millette. And that is entirely appropriate because we have a copy of Larry Millette's book, Mysterious Tales of Old St. Paul, heading your way, John. So that should be perfect for that. Now, this time around, we have a little something from the IHOSE vaults as we give you this clue. A curse-encumbered household in the West, inspired of all the detective tales, is best. If you know the answer to this canonical couplet, put it in an email. Address a comment at ihearofsherlock.com with canonical couplet in the subject line. If your answer is correct and chosen at random from all the correct answers, you'll win. Good luck. Yeah, and you know, if it's been going anything like the previous few episodes, you'll have a good chance of winning. Not too many people have entered in the past couple of episodes. So consider that an incentive. If you'd like to throw your name in the ring, you will be among few friends. Very few. How do you like that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, here we are, Bert. It is the eve of Halloween. Ooh. You got your candy ready?
Yes, yes.
What are you giving out?
We always buy the same bag of assorted candy and get very few trick-or-treaters. And so in 4 or 6 weeks, we'll be sitting around saying, how come we gained all this weight? What happened?
Well, that should be fun. We're doing, what are we doing? We're doing jelly beans again this year.
Jelly beans?
Yeah.
Don't you do a trunk and treat in the neighborhood? Those have become very popular. We did a trunk and treat a couple of years ago, and it took me until, the 3rd or 4th of November to get out of the trunk Kathy put me in.
Well, we do have a pretty nice neighborhood around here. We don't do trunk or treating. We do, I actually claim the porch. Mindy goes off with Grace to take her around the neighborhood, but I claim the porch because directly opposite us, on the opposite corner, our neighbor dresses up in a ghillie suit and has a chainsaw and jumps out from behind the shrubs and chases the kids down the street.
Yeah, but that's every day. What does he do for Halloween?
he just sits around. So it is a laugh a minute as we sit on the porch and watch hundreds and hundreds of kids get scared half to death.
Oh, dear.
But, we're doing jelly beans. We're doing Bertie Bott's every flavor beans.
Bertie Bott's.
So, things like earwax and dirt and wallpaper paste. I think those are some of the favorites.
Do you wear a costume? Do you put on fancy clothes?
No, I don't. I don't. I like to just enjoy myself at the expense of the kids. And if they don't like it, well, tough. Because I'm not getting any candy. Well, I should say that differently. I do get candy, but it's at the end of the evening. I go out and pick up all the candy that those scared kids have spilled running away from the chainsaw guy. So, little effort, lots of remuneration.
Yeah, I'd stay away from the candy apples, particularly the ones that have got little grass clippings all over them.
Well, the ones that have the razor blades in them, Look out for the tainted stuff, kids.
No.
Well, I think we've tainted this episode quite enough. So this is the,
what is it?
I guess the untainted Scott Monty.
And I'm the completely unadulterated Burt Wolder.
I love it. Be careful out there, kids. And until next time around these parts, the game's afoot.
The game's afoot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.